Forward. I met Hans Goebeler in 1989 during the early months of my employment at the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. At that time I was but a lowly assistant to the then registrar and collections manager, and working to finish the restoration project of U-505 in 1988 and '89. To celebrate the completion of that restoration, the most aggressive since the arrival of U-505 in 1954, a rededication was planned, and Navy veterans from both sides were invited to attend. Because I was a recent arrival at the museum, I was not directly invited to attend the reunion. However, my interest in military history in general, and in U-505 in particular, drove me to crash the party anyway, with the promise that I would not interfere with the gathering. My most vivid recollection of that day was how impressed I was that former enemies, language barriers notwithstanding, could meet again under less deadly circumstances and freely discuss their experiences. They were genuinely happy to see each other. Some talked of the boat, some spoke of their individual roles on the morning of June 4th, 1944, and others were just happy to be among friends old and new. One of these men at this reunion was Hans Goebeler. It was there I learned what an amazing man Hans was. Although he had been a lowly control room mate, and thus not an officer, he played a key role in organizing the reunion of U-505's crew. Inside his 5-foot 6-inch tall frame, an ideal height for a World War II submariner, was a much larger presence that impressed me each time we met until his death in the late 1990s. The former 65-year-old Kriegsmarine member lifted weights to stay in shape, a routine that helped him maintain his youthful, heavily muscled chest. He had an air of confidence and a devilish smile that naturally drew people to him. His eyes sparkled with humor and good cheer. Hans told me about the success he enjoyed as a student and entry into the U-boat service, and how the former paved the way for the latter. We shared many jokes over the years, and he was always ready to tell a good story about his time on the old boat. After several visits from Hans and many phone calls, I realized his stories were important to record for posterity. Passing them on to the tour guides working on U-505 so they could share them with visitors was one thing, but the recollections would eventually be lost or changed unless they were written down. In addition to his first-hand stories, Hans himself added a unique dimension to the U-505 experience. Whenever he stopped by, Hans loved to give informal tours to visitors. He became part of the exhibit for a day, standing in the control room talking about a piece of equipment or a particular experience to anyone who had an interest. Inevitably, a tour group would pass through, and somehow its members would sense Hans had a direct connection with the boat. Perhaps it was his accent, or simply his obvious expertise. But once the cat was out of the bag, the only thing to do was to step back and watch. Touring U-505 with a former crew member is both a rare and unforgettable experience, and for Hans it was very satisfying. I always enjoyed watching the absolute attention he could command from the visitors as he spoke about life aboard U-505 while standing at his former duty station. The visitors, as one might imagine, were in total awe. Many took the opportunity to ask some tough questions about what it meant to be a German submariner in World War II. What was life on board like? How he felt at the time of the capture, how he feels about it now so many decades later. I think all of this attention and outpouring of gratitude helped Hans flesh out and finish his memoir. I was relieved to learn he had been thinking for some time about penning his recollections, and had been gathering information from former comrades and checking his facts with them and through other sources. Hans wanted to be sure to tell his own story as well as he could, but also to represent the point of view of a common sailor. Fortunately for us, Hans was more amused than deterred by any potential critics of his efforts, which likely made him more determined to complete his book. Unlike so many memoirs of service, Hans found a way to present his own personal experiences within the broader context of World War II very well. His recollections, which will be especially valuable to generations yet unborn, outline his path into the U-boats, his service on U-505. Hans made every combat patrol aboard that single U-boat, shore leave, the capture of the boat on June 4, 1944, and his interesting life as a POW. I particularly enjoy the stories of life at sea and tales of the POW experience of the crew, which helped breathe life into the 750-ton U-505 exhibit. In 1998, the Museum of Science and Industry began planning an important oral history project. Its purpose was to interview as many German crew members as possible, as well as the key players from CTG 22.3, Dan Gallery's task group that captured U-505. The project was well organized and underway the following year, and we had identified the people we believed needed to be interviewed for posterity. Hans cheerfully offered his assistance. He helped contact several of his comrades on our behalf and, naturally enough, agreed to provide an interview. And then tragedy struck. About this time, Hans was diagnosed with the lung cancer that would take his life. He was optimistic throughout his battle with the terrible disease and encouraged us to wait until after his next treatment before we came to see him, for he was confident he would beat the cancer. I spoke with him on the phone shortly before he died, and by that time we all knew he was losing his battle with cancer. Erica, Hans's wife, told us he did not look well enough to be on camera, and it was clear from his voice the disease had sapped his strength. He no longer had enough energy even for an interview. We were all deeply saddened when the news of his passing arrived. We also knew we had missed a valuable opportunity to preserve his legacy on film. Thankfully, I had the foresight to make audio recordings of many of our conversations. Hans was the last living U-505 crew member in the United States. When he died, there were 11 men left alive. Today, the number stands at 10. Hans's death was a great loss to both his family, the museum staff, and the U-boat community. Thankfully, however, Hans had worked tirelessly during the months leading up to his death to complete his memoir, which was originally published in a small-run private paperback printing shortly after he died. I know how proud Hans would be today if he could see his old boat. U-505 has been moved indoors to a new protective underground environment and restored with her wartime paint, both inside and out. I am particularly proud to know that the long conversations with Hans and the expertise that only a former crew member can provide are part of the experience every visitor will enjoy during the walk through the boat. Through his personal visits and recorded conversations, Hans helped the museum and its patrons understand the submarine's complexity and intricacies. His posthumous memoir, Steel Boat, Iron Hearts, A U-Boat Crewman's Life Aboard U-505, helps all of us understand and appreciate what it must have been like to serve aboard U-505. Keith Gill,